Welcome back to Humanities 2. I'm Ivan Spencer. Today we'll be looking at Marx and the rise of communism. There's no more controversial person in the whole history of ideas than Karl Marx and his ideas. And everyone has some leaning one way or another in some view of him. I grew up in the 1960s in a home where patriotic Americans, my dad was from the military, had served in the Navy during the Cold War, so it's no surprise that the household I grew up in, Marx was a persona non grata because of his association with communism. And so anything to do with Karl Marx had to be bad. And so, but I knew very little of Marx until much later on as I began to study and read his works on my own. And so today we're going to look at some very powerful ideas that have a continuing activity in our world. There are many people who buy into Marx's ideas in one way or another, hard forms, soft forms, and so forth and so on. So we're going to look at some of the key themes here and try to understand what exactly Marx was saying, and then try to understand how people built political systems upon it. Now Marx, I know this might be kind of hard to accept, but he himself may not have advocated some of the harder forms of communism that emerged. Right before he died, within a couple of years of his death, he said, "I am not a Marxist." The idea being that people had taken his ideas and gone much further than he anticipated. But anyway, let's go through some of the main themes here and see if we can begin to understand them. The key themes are, one of the first themes is liberation. He sees himself as coming up with a way to liberate the poor from the oppression that they have undergone during the Industrial Revolution. The whole idea of class struggle and a dialectic between these classes, struggle and dialectic are almost kind of the same concept here. We'll get into what dialectic means. It's kind of a sophisticated philosophical concept. But the idea that there are two classes that struggle together and they clash together in a kind of historical fashion all throughout history is something that is a distinctly Marxist idea. We'll look at capitalism and what capitalists, at least in his day, endeavored to do. We will look at communism and the whole idea of its central concept of the abolition of private property. We will look at the labor theory of value, not something that Marx invented, but an idea that Marx takes and uses throughout his economic theories. We'll look at the whole idea of history heading somewhere. Marx thinks that history is going somewhere in a sense that this kind of class struggle is a cyclical thing, and eventually this cyclical process will wind up in a termination. And this will be a classless society, a society without classes anymore, okay? Then we'll look at religion, the concept of religion as the opiate of the masses, and try to understand how Marx understood religion and so forth. It's no secret that he's a thoroughgoing atheist, but he's he kind of, his attack on religion and his brand of atheism is kind of different. There are many flavors of atheism, and so we'll look at his distinct version. And then we'll look at the concept of scientific Marxism along the way as well. The idea that Marx thought he was creating a science, that it was a scientific endeavor. And we see that mostly in a work that we're not going to be reading, but in Das Kapital, usually considered his magnum opus. But we'll discuss that a little bit as well. So the key texts that we're going to be looking at in this study are the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Also his a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And then by way of reference, though we're not reading, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. I take it that probably all of you have read the Communist Manifesto at some point. It's fairly widely read and an easy access point to grasping some of the key ideas of Marxism. The key people here, obviously Karl Marx, his close friend Friedrich Engels, who they together wrote the Communist Manifesto. Engels and he collaborated together on many, many projects, writing projects and so forth and so on. But there was a very close friendship there between them. G.F.W. Hegel, George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. Hegel being an important philosopher preceding Marx, whose system, Hegelianism, will become an important component to Marxist thought. Also, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach also being someone that precedes Marx, and parts of his system, his materialistic thought, will be important parts of Marx's ideas. We'll look at each one of these along the way some. The time period here we're talking about is mid-19th century. It's during the height of the Industrial Revolution, and Marx himself lived from 1818 to 1883. And so this is squarely in the middle of the 19th century as capitalism is muscled up and becomes a very powerful force in society. The Industrial Revolution is changing all kinds of things, okay? So that's the chief time period we're looking at. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The workers have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Workers of the world unite. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Man makes religion. Religion does not make man. And religion is the opiate of the masses. These are all famous quotes from Karl Marx, and they express some aspect of his momentous political and economic philosophy. So as I've said, there's no one more controversial in the whole history of ideas. I don't know, Freud might give him a run for his money there, but Marx's ideas seem to have a whole lot more implications for the world. And so you simply cannot understand the world today. You can't understand the map of the world today. Take any globe and spin it around and look at all the countries of the world and think about the political systems that dominate those different countries and places, and you can't understand that globe without understanding Karl Marx's ideas, okay? So no one in the modern era continues to affect our world more than Marx, even down to this very moment. His political ideas have inspired billions of people and remain to this moment a major political perspective. So countless interpretations and applications of Marx abound in social theory, political theory, economics, the arts, and the humanities. It's almost like an entire worldview. And his ideas inspire all kinds of different interpretations and different views, critiques of society, critiques of culture, and so forth and so on. It's an entire axis of thought, if you will, okay? We can only cover some of the basic themes today and some of the basic concepts, but Marxist-inspired studies cover vast areas of cultural criticism today. Now, Marx's primary motive and goal throughout his life seems to be an honest effort to try to liberate the masses from oppression and poverty. And so he is going to engage in a type of analysis, a critique, if you will, a criticism that is going to look at the world in a new way, in a different way. And Marx is one of these people, one of these thinkers that once you understand what he says, once you have read him and you thoroughly grasp or closely grasp most of what he's talking about, it's almost like you can't quite see the world the same way again. That doesn't mean you have to agree with his solutions at all. And many people do agree with some of his criticisms and his analysis, but without buying into all of his solutions, okay? So he sees history as a long dialectic kind of class struggle of the wealthy and the poor. And what a dialectic is, and this is a somewhat of a difficult concept for people to grasp, for students to grasp. A dialectic is where you have two opposing forces, and those two opposing forces somehow or another fuel each other. They, in fact, one of them arises from the other as an opposition, but then they kind of fuel each other. There's an escalation, if you will, okay? And these two escalating forces will eventually cancel each other out. But in the canceling out, something too will be preserved. And that preservation, what is preserved of those two opposing forces, will then go on to become its own new force, okay? And we'll talk about Hegel's conception of this, because this was Hegel's contribution to the world of thought, this dialectic mode of thinking. But Marx is going to transform Hegel's thought, and we'll look at the relationship there a little bit. But the point now is that Marx sees history, all of history, going back to primitive times, if you will, as a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, between the rich and the poor. He will put it in terms of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, okay? That would be the capitalists and the wage earners, the laborers, okay? Two great hostile camps. In our current day, or at least within recent political history here in the U.S., perhaps the whole talk about the 1% and the 99% would be an expression of that kind of idea, the 1% being the extraordinarily wealthy people in our world who have means of production in some way or another, usually controlling industries, companies, corporations, and so forth and so on. They have ways of attaining such great wealth. And then the rest of us, the 99%, who don't have that. And somehow or another, one way or another, we work for or purchase or in some way are, put it in Marxist terms, are oppressed by those 1%, okay? So another expression going along the lines of the 1% and the 99% would be the recent Occupy Wall Street movement, which was perhaps not a communist movement, but nevertheless something greatly inspired by Marxist thought, okay? So anyway, back to Marx and his concepts. Capitalists amass large sums of money, and then they use that money to purchase the newest and most powerful forms of technology during their day to produce commodities at lower and lower costs. Now, they do this so that they can earn profits and money. But these large factories, at least during Marx's age, this was factory production with machines powered by steam and so forth and so on. These large factories need laborers, essentially human machines, human operators of the machines, and for the most part, unskilled. In other words, you didn't really have to do a whole lot of training of a person to operate these machines that would produce things in mass quantities, okay? Now, these laborers are paid an hourly wage, not much, and no more than is necessary for their subsistence. This is what Marx calls a subsistence salary. Basically, all they need to eat and purchase the bare minimum things that they need to survive and get along in this world, no more. So they live in kind of a perpetual state of poverty, okay? So the poor working class, according to Marx, is going to be alienated from their labor. So their product, they're going to be alienated from whatever it is they're producing. Whatever product they're making is something that they will be alienated from. You can think of, for example, factory conditions where one laborer might be doing one tiny little task all day long and never even really sees the final product of their labor. They're not involved in the whole production of a product. They're just involved in one tiny little repetitive task. And so in many ways, that's just one example of how they're alienated from their labor, okay? So that, in other words, they get no fulfillment from what they're doing. It's drudgery, okay? They're also alienated from their community because the products that they produce are not something that they then turn around and personally sell to the community that creates those communal connections, okay? And so they're alienated from their labor. And most of all, they participate in none of the profits. They get no profits at all. The person who owns the factory, the capitalist, gets all the profits from this operation, okay? So eventually, according to Marx, the workers become so penniless, so overworked, many of them worked 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, in conditions that could only be described as dangerous and inhumane. They may be injured. If it wasn't for some outright injury, like maybe getting a finger cut off, perhaps it was just repetitive stress injuries and the pain in the human body that comes from doing the same thing all day long. But anyway, these poor people in these factory conditions become so indebted to the rich capitalists that the rich capitalists own everything. Often what they would do, the factory owner would buy up all the housing around his factory so that his workers had a place to live, but they also paid rent to him. And also he might buy the stores close by so that his workers bought things from the store. And so all of those efforts, the rentals and the stores and everything, they too drained the worker of their profits. And so essentially the worker lived hand to mouth and had very few options and could not get out of a kind of system that had him locked down in an impoverished state. Okay. Marx sees this type of a dismal situation in mid-19th century industrial societies in France and Germany and England. Those were the three big ones. Anyway, he determines to come up with a solution, and he does. And the world has not been the same ever since. His solution is a political, economic, and social theory that aims to resolve the class struggle and achieve a classless society that I've spoken of before. Everyone will be equal. Everyone will be equal in a political sense, economical sense, and socially. The world will be flattened on those scales, if you will. And so for Marx, the resolution will come through an active and, if need be, a violent revolution where the poor rise up, the proletariat rises up and overthrows the old capitalist order and establishes a government that allows, and this is very key, no private property. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx states, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. Why is private property so bad? Well, first, Marx says that property does not really mean the hard-earned personal effects of the laborer, his clothes, his dwelling, his shoes, and things like that. He doesn't mean that level of private property at all. Hard-earned things that we use for our personal life and so forth and so on, maybe even our home, our dwelling. He's not referring to that level of private property. Abolition of private property means that no individual owns the means of production, either the means of services, like a service type of company or some type of a service industry or something like that, or the commodities. Now, in his day and age, the Industrial Revolution was focused on commodities, so we hear a lot about commodities. We live now in a kind of a service-oriented society, but where most of us don't really produce commodities anymore. We'll talk a little bit about how the world has moved on later on. But the idea here is that no individual could own the means of producing essential commodities for human consumption. And here's the reason. It's because property owners, people who own corporations or factories of that nature, they use giant machinery to mass produce things, but at the same time what they're doing is paying the laborers in their company the lowest possible wage that they can. Now, you have to remember, mid-19th century, there were no laws in place that prevented this. There was no minimum wage, for example. You could pay people as little as you possibly could. as long as they kept working for you. But you had to pay them enough that they could live. You had to pay them enough that they could eat and clothe themselves a little bit. But anyway, it's in the factory owner's interest to get the wages as far down as possible, because your wage costs are your biggest cost in any operation, even to this day. This is the most expensive part of most operations, most industries today, is the labor costs. But enormous profits come to the capitalist, who captures what Marx calls the surplus value of the laborer. So he captures the labor value of the laborer, in other words, pays the laborer very little, but the value of the labor is actually much higher. And so the difference between those, let's say that I'm paying a laborer $2 an hour, but really I'm taking his labor and turning it into something that's worth $10 an hour. The $8 difference I get to keep if I'm the person that owns the company, okay, or the industry. So that's the surplus value of the labor, and that's my profit, okay. So no profits go to the laborer at all who makes the goods, okay. His labor is discounted. Now, this leads Marx to the whole idea of the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value, again, is not something Marx invented, but he is going to take it and use it in such a way to great lengths to explain all kinds of economic realities and dynamics that other economists hadn't. He gets this theory first from Locke, Adam Smith, and Ricardo, but he extends the theory to say that all value is created by human labor alone. So the value of any object, according to someone who thoroughly buys into a Marxist view, the value of any object is the labor that made it. How much labor is in something? So if I have an apple in my hand, how much labor is in my hand? In other words, somebody had to go out and plant the tree, someone had to tend it, prune it, then, so forth and so on, and then ultimately someone had to pick it and then transport it and so forth and so on. So every step of the way, from planting the tree all the way to, stocking it in a store, there's a little bit of labor put in the product. And that's alone, according to Marx, what gives it value. And so it is for everything, according to Marx. There is no source of value outside the human labor invested into objects, okay? And so he extends this theory out and makes it a kind of flat line, or this is kind of like the main constant in his whole theory. The factory workers thus create all the value in a product, and they really benefit from none of the value that they make. And he called this theory the alienation of labor. And this estrangement leads to dire consequences for life and for human flourishing when people are alienated from their labor. So let me see if I can give you an example of this. Let's just say that I have a bar of steel, okay, a piece of stock steel. Well, it took a certain amount of labor to get the iron ore, to smelt it and so forth and so on, and ultimately to make this iron bar. So there's some labor itself into the iron bar. But now let's just take the iron bar. Let's just say that iron is fairly cheap. Let's just say this iron bar costs $10. Okay. Now let's suppose that I take the iron bar, and now I, manipulate it and put work into it and so forth and so on, and then I make sewing needles from this steel. Okay. Now what is it worth? Well, let's just say that I made 10,000 needles from it, and let's say each needle, is worth $1. And it's a fairly expensive needle, but you get the idea. Well, now the bar went from being worth $10 to, $10,000, okay? And so the point being that me putting my labor into the steel makes it worth more. But now let's just suppose that I take the steel and I do something else with it. I take the bar and I make little watch parts for like fine Swiss watches or something like that, little gears and little little wheels and things that are needed inside of a watch. And this takes far more work. These have to be much more precisely made than a needle. And so now, maybe I've taken that one bar of steel and I turn it into something that has the value of $100,000. You can make a lot of tiny little watch parts out of a big bar of steel. So you see here on this illustration, at least, what makes the little watch parts valuable, or the needles valuable, and so forth and so on, is not necessarily the base material. It's the amount of labor that goes into the base material. Okay. And so labor is what gives things their value on this economic theory that he has here. Now, to show you another illustration of how a capitalist might alienate workers from their labor, let me give you another illustration. Let's just suppose that it's the year 1400, and back in the Renaissance period, and let's suppose that all of us we live in an Italian city, and we make shoes. Our forefathers made shoes. We're artisans. We're good at making shoes by hand. And so we buy the leather and the other things that we need, but mostly the leather. And then we craft that leather into a product that an individual person, one of our clients, needs, into a pair of shoes. Now, to make this illustration simple, let's just imagine that we could make a pair of shoes in one day. That's how much work it takes for a professional cobbler, a shoemaker, to make a pair of shoes. Okay, so we make a pair of shoes, we make a commodity, we sell it, and we get money for it, but what we get is basically a day's wages for it. We could take that day's wages in money and then go out and buy something else that we might need, like a chair. Let's just say that someone else is a carpenter and they make chairs, and let's just say that their chair took them a whole day to make. Well, I would exchange my shoes. I could barter just one for one, my pair of shoes for his chair, but I could also use the money, and I would trade my pair of shoes through the exchange of money for his chair. Okay. If it was a whole table and 6 chairs, that might take 6 or 8 pairs of shoes for that. But the carpenter can't use 6 or 8 pairs of shoes, and so I give him money. Okay. Well, fairly simple. I mean, it's just simple economics. Okay. But now let's suppose that in the middle of that Renaissance, you come across someone who's an inventor, like Leonardo da Vinci or somebody like that. You're a shoemaker, and he's really good at making machines and things. He's not a scientist yet, but he still knows how to make machines and get things done. So you hire him to build you a machine that will help you make shoes. And so he does. He comes up with a machine that stamps out maybe the sole of the shoe for you. And now you paid him a lot of money for that, and you bring it into your shoe shop, and now you hire someone to come in and to run the machine for you and to stamp out soles. Well, now you can make 2 pairs of shoes in a day, whereas the rest of us shoemakers can only make 1 pair a day. Well, you have a distinct advantage over us now. So one of the things that you start doing is you might lower the price of your shoes, say from $100 to $90. So now your shoes are a little more attractive in price. And over the next years, decades, you make enough money to buy a whole shop full of machines. And so now you've got a small little factory going, and you've got a machine doing different parts of the operation. And now, let's just say by the time you retire and you hand this over to your son, he's able to put out, let's just say he's able to put out 100 pairs of shoes a day. Well, the rest of us haven't done that yet. We haven't figured out what you're doing, and we don't know. And so we figure out we start seeing that the market starts being very difficult for us to survive. I can't sell my shoes for $100 every day because, you and your son are selling them for $50 a pair, and you've got 100 pairs to sell every day. So this goes on for a great while, and next thing you know, you take all that money that you've been making and you build a giant factory. And this giant factory has all kinds of exquisite machines and so forth and so on in it. And you are now able to put out 1,000 pairs of shoes a day. And you're selling them for 30 bucks. Well, the rest of us shoemakers, we can't even sell ours now. We can't sell our shoes for nearly any price that would keep us alive. And so we're put out of business. You drove us out of business. But you're a kind capitalist, so you offer to hire us in your factory. And so now I go over to your factory and I work for you, and you pay me, $5 an hour to work in your factory. Now I'm making shoes on giant machines, and now I don't sell them to the individuals in my community, and I have no organic connection anymore. Maybe the shoes are even shipped off to some other place in the world and sold there. And so this is how capitalism begins. And then the next thing you know, you take your money, and you and your sons, you take your money and you build factories in other cities, and you create a kind of giant monopoly, and you drive out all the shoemakers everywhere. And now the price of the shoes are down to 20 bucks. Nobody can compete with that. But simultaneously now, all the old shoemakers are just working in the factories and barely getting by, because you're not going to pay them any more than you have to. There's no laws or anything that forces you to pay more. Okay, this is all before our social welfare economy and laws that protect workers and so forth. So you see, the idea here, according to Marx, and this comes out in his magnum opus, Das Kapital, The Capitalist, and he says that the old artisans, the way we used to be when we were cobblers and shoemakers, in the pre-capitalist economy, we handmade commodities to barter with other makers and to get other commodities. We made commodities to get commodities. And in between, there might need to be money as an exchange medium, and usually there was, okay? But the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, they all traded goods, usually on a basis of some equal effort. Whatever it took you a day to make, I'll trade you for what I have, it takes a day to make. There was division of labor. I could make shoes far better than the butcher, and he couldn't make shoes at all. And you get the idea here. He gets better shoes, I get better meat. We all get better products and so forth because we're cooperating. But we only produce our commodities to get other commodities. So money just emerges as to help transactions between commodities. Now, along comes the capitalist, and it shifts from a CMC, commodity money commodity type of exchange system, to an MCM, money, commodity, money. In other words, capitalists spend great money on machines. Why? Because they just want to make more money. So the commodity, the shoes in our illustration, just becomes a tool, a medium by which to make more money. Okay, so we're not making the shoes because we like to make shoes. We're not making the shoes because we feel organically connected to the product that we're making, and it connects us to the community. No, we're only making shoes to make money. Okay, this is the capitalist way. So this slowly begins to shift our culture and shift the way we look at ourselves and so forth and so on. We start to look at human beings as machines who fit into production. Okay, and so when the mechanical means of making commodities became available in the Industrial Revolution, capitalists invested a lot of money in machines to make greater quantities of commodities to make more money. Now, remember we talked about the scientific revolution with Newton and so forth and so on. That scientific revolution precedes this industrial revolution, because once you understand how things work and you can do experiments and so forth and so on, you can really capture the power of nature to make machines do things for you. Okay, so this began to emerge in Europe in the late 17th century, and especially 18th century, and then up into Marx's age, the 19th century. So capitalists want money only to make money. Whereas the old organic artisans of the past, the medieval world and so forth and so on, made commodities to trade for other commodities. So by Marx's day, 4 centuries later, industrial strength capitalism had impoverished most people. He claimed about 90% of the people lived in poverty, and they were thrown down into the labor class. No laws protected them. There was no social welfare state, nothing like that. No food stamps, labor laws, no OSHA to protect them and make them safe. And so all of those things, by the way, are really a kind of soft form of socialism anyway. We have those things today in part because of Marxist critiques and others who took Marxist insights into the overextended form or powerful forms of capitalism, okay? So his momentous solution is for the poor to unite and rise up and overthrow this oppressive industrialist capitalist structure of society. And in this overthrow, this is where the dialectic, the class struggle, comes to a clash. What will come out of that clash will be a classless society, okay? All capital, all means of production, including land, will become property of the state in a classless state. There will be no more classes according to wealth or even education, okay? And so we'll get rid of class altogether. Everyone will be equal. And the ethic will be, to quote Marx, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.